So this week we're going to be looking at Samuel. I know that last week Josh and Sophie talked through the whole book of Ruth. You'll probably be glad to know that this week I'm not looking at all 55 chapters of First and Second Samuel, but instead just the first three chapters of First Samuel. So there's 4 points I'm going to try and pull out throughout this talk from those first three chapters, and it might be useful for you to jot them down on a piece of paper when I say them, because they could come in handy when Claire unpacks later a bit how we can apply this story to our prayer lives. So we're going to dive straight in right now. So he starts off in 1 Samuel chapter 1, hearing about a woman called Hannah. So she's married to a man called Elkanah, whose name I'm sure I'm saying wrong, but we'll just roll with it. And Elkanah had another wife called Peninnah, who I'm probably saying that name wrong. But Peninnah had several children. And we learn that Elkanah would go up from where he lived to a place called Shiloh to worship and sacrifice to God. We learn in verses 5 and 6 that Hannah, unlike Peninnah, had not been able to have any children, and that because of this, she was taunted by Peninnah in order to irritate her, and that this went on for many years. Verse 7 of 1 Samuel chapter 1 says that Hannah would become so upset by this that she would weep and she wouldn't eat food. So we look at now at verses 10 and 11 of 1 Samuel chapter 1, where we see Hannah filled with a deep anguish and weeping bitterly. She cries out to God and hands over her situation to him. She vows to God that if he would give her a son, she would dedicate her son's life to him. So we have another character, Eli, who was a priest, and he saw Hannah crying out to God. But at first he thought that Hannah was drunk, because Hannah was praying in her heart. She wasn't praying out loud, but her lips were still moving. And it wasn't a crazy suggestion, because they'd just finished a meal and she just stood up and started praying to herself. But when he realized that Hannah was not drunk and was praying to God, he added his blessing to hers in verse 17, saying, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you've asked him." So Hannah left, and she went and she ate food, and she was no longer sad, it says in the Bible. And so that's our first point that we might want to jot down, is that Hannah poured out her heart to God, and God gave her a peace about the situation that she brought to him. So jumping straight back in again, moving on to verse 20, we find out that God granted Hannah's request and that she became pregnant and gave birth to a son called Samuel. Then in verses 24 and 28, when Samuel was old enough, Hannah took Samuel and presented him before God. And from then on, Samuel lived in the house of God in Shiloh with Eli. So this is the second point that we want to jot down, which is that Hannah, once God had answered her prayers, did what she said she'd do. She made good on her promise, and she dedicated Samuel's life to the Lord. So we're going to move on quickly and just brush over chapter 2. Sorry, I'm not going to make any points from here, but it's really useful to understand what's in it. So we read in chapter 2 about Hannah's praise and worship for God about what he's done. I just think, how cool is it that actually Hannah's response to seeing God working in her life is to worship. We also learn in chapter 2 that there was trouble in Eli's household because he could not control his children. And we read about what God said that he would do if Eli could not rein in his sons. But then we're going to jump straight into chapter 3 again. And we're going to read about the first time that God spoke to Samuel. So in verses 2 to 7, we read about how one night when Samuel was laying down in the house of God, he heard the voice of God call out his name, but he did not know it was God. So he got up and he went to Eli and he said, "Here I am, you called me." But Eli said, "I did not call. Go back and lie down." So Samuel went back and lay down. I think it's quite interesting that actually for Samuel to have been able to confuse God's voice for Eli, God must have been speaking audibly to Samuel, which is something that we don't actually see that often. I thought that was quite notable. So after Samuel went back, he lays down again, and then God says to him again, "Samuel." So he gets back up and he goes to Eli, and he says, "Here I am, you called me." Eli says again, "I did not call. Go back and lie down." So Samuel went back and lay down again. And then in verse 8, the same thing happens again, except this time Eli realizes that it's the Lord who is calling Samuel. So he says, "Go back and lie down. But if the Lord calls you again, respond, "Speak, for your servant is listening." And so we come on to our third point to note down, which is that Samuel didn't know that it was God who was speaking to him because he didn't recognize his voice. I was reading these passages and I found myself wondering, if I heard a voice calling my name in the middle of the night, would my first thought be that that's God calling my name? Just thought that was interesting. But we're going to jump straight back into the story now. So Samuel returns and he lies down again, and the Lord calls his name, and he does what he was told by Eli. He responds, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." And then God spoke to Samuel, and he told Samuel that he was going to do what he had threatened in chapter 2 against Eli. So then the next day, Eli gets up and he asks Samuel what the Lord had said to him the night before. And though Samuel was afraid to tell him, he tells Eli what Samuel had said, or what God had said to him. I mean, I can't even begin to imagine what must have been going through Samuel's head when Eli asked him what God had said. But how cool is it that actually, even though God's message for Eli was bad news and would have been really hard to tell Eli, Samuel still shared it, and he still did it, even though it was so difficult. So that's our fourth point to jot down, actually, that even though it was so difficult, Samuel still honored God. So I'm now going to hand over to Claire, and she's going to think a bit more about how we might learn from this story and apply it to how we engage in prayer in general, but more specifically in this coming prayer week.
Okay, as if by magic, Claire appears. Okay, so thanks, James, for sharing something of the life of Hannah and his son Samuel this morning. You know, I think it's really important actually to just stop a minute and remind ourselves that when we're looking at these Old Testament characters, as we have been over these weeks, that we're actually looking at the lives of real people. You know, the Bible isn't a fictional storybook, but it's actually an account of real people's lives and their place in God's plan. So let's just remember, as we talk about Hannah and Samuel this morning, these were real people. So this week, Gateway's planning a week of prayer because as a church, we feel it's so important to have periods where we pause and seek God together. You know, we're going to take time to simply be in God's presence this week and to rest with him. We're also going to spend time seeking God to intervene in situations and also seeking to hear God's direction in our lives, in the lives of our church, and in ways in which we can share love with the world around us. So if you're part of the Gateway family, don't be a spectator this week, but plan to set aside time to be part of this prayer week. And if you're not, well, you want to be part of our Gateway family. But yeah, I hope that as we talk today about prayer, you'll be encouraged to set aside time to ask God to speak personally to you this week. So this morning, I'm just going to pull out, as James said, a few points from the life of Samuel and Hannah that might perhaps inspire us to set aside that time this week to pray. So we heard firstly how Hannah was a woman who cried out in desperation. You know, the Bible says that she was in deep anguish. And I guess my question is, what in your life is causing you deep anguish right now? You know, for Hannah, it was the fact that she couldn't have children. Maybe for you, it's that somebody who's dear to you is just ill right now, or you just can't get the job that you long to have, or life just has not worked out the way that you dreamed it would have done. And I'm sure actually for some of us, there's a lot of anxiety and anguish over this period where we're neither in complete lockdown, we're not fully opened up, and really we're unsure whether vaccines will or won't work. We absolutely hope that they do, but we're in a bit of a time of change, aren't we? And that causes us anguish. Well, I feel the encouragement here from Hannah's life is that God cares. He wants us to pour out our hearts to him. He wants us to talk with him about what's causing us pain. You know, no matter how big or small that pain is, he wants us to passionately share with him. So whilst our God is a holy God, and we absolutely should approach him with awe and wonder, he is also a God that desires to be our Father and invites us to enter into a relationship with him where we're able to openly pour out our hearts to him. So that's my first thought. As we approach this week of prayer, let's respectfully approach our Father and passionately bring to him the things that matter to us, to our church, to the community, and things that are going on in the wider world. You know, I love that as we read on in 1 Samuel 1, that after Hannah had poured out her heart to God, it says she got up and she began to eat and she was no longer sad. And that reminds me actually of a couple of verses in Philippians 4, where the Apostle Paul encouraged us to not worry, but to pray about everything, telling God what we need and thanking him for all he's done, so that we might experience a peace that transcends all understanding. You know, I want a bit of that peace that transcends all understanding. Do you want a bit of that peace this morning? I don't know how many of you remember back to March 2020 when the country locked down and there was so much fear and uncertainty. But actually, as a church, if you remember, we gathered every morning and we prayed about anything and everything. And I remember so many of us in the church remarking on how that gave us peace in the midst of what was going on around us. So now as we start to unlock, many of us again may be faced with the need for peace. So let's do what God is offering to us and pour out our hearts to him this week and seek him. Another thing that stands out as we read about Hannah is that she was desperate and she bargained with God. She told God that if he gave her the most precious gift of being a mother, then she would give that son back to him. As a mother, that seems a little bit strange that she would have a child and then give it away to live in the temple with the priests. But actually, as parents, we all have to let our children go at some point. We have to let them grow up. We have to let them become independent and live their lives. There's nothing in the Bible, guys, to suggest that Hannah still wasn't a big part of Samuel's life, that she didn't visit regularly and she didn't watch him grow up into one of Israel's great and faithful judges. So actually, what an honor it must have been for her to be Samuel's mum. I think it's important to note that when Hannah bargained with God, she carried through. And if we choose to bargain with God, we too need to be prepared to keep our side of the bargain if God chooses to grant us our heart's cry. You know, God is faithful, isn't he? We've often said God is faithful and he keeps his promises. And if we are going to become like him, then we too need to be faithful and we need to keep our promises too. In our house groups this week, I think it'd be a really interesting discussion to discuss whether Hannah's approach to bargaining with God was a good approach and whether it's right for us as we passionately cry out to God this week to do the same. I just think that'd make for an interesting discussion for us to take back to our groups this week. But what we do know, though, is that on this occasion, God did respond to her heartfelt cries. He gave her a son that she named Samuel, which derives from the Hebrew expression heard of God, actually. She kept her end of the bargain. And when Samuel was old enough, she took him back to the temple and dedicated him to the Lord. And God did great things through Samuel's life. You know, God responded. As I was reading this, I was thinking about 5 years ago when I made a half serious comment to God that if he did something, then I'd apply to go to Bible college. Well, a few weeks later, God reminded me of that comment and said, if I really meant it and it happened, I needed to be prepared to carry out my side of the bargain. And the very next day, God did exactly what I'd asked of him. And I was then faced with that choice of keeping my end of the bargain. You'll be pleased to know I did. And 5 years later, I finished it and waiting for my results. And actually, wow, what amazing things God has done with my life because I kept my end of the bargain. So yeah, let's just think about that. When we bargain with God, we need to keep our side. In our midweek group, when we meet on a Monday, there's always someone in our group who likes to take the opportunity to slip in a little book recommendation. So I'm not going to give you one, I'm going to give you two. So this is Red Moon Rising and its sequel, Dirty Glory. Okay, both of these books are written about the 24/7 prayer movement and are full of life stories of people who came passionately before God. They sought him and great things happened. So if you haven't read either of them, can I encourage you to get a copy of one of those books and read them and let them inspire you in your prayer life. Great books. So lastly, on Hannah, we read about how after God heard her prayers and answered them, she praised him. And you can read that prayer of praise in 1 Samuel 2. Well, this week, as we passionately cry out to God, let's also not forget to passionately praise him for all the prayers that he's already answered in our lives and the lives of those we know. As well as passionately crying out to God this week for what's on our heart, we also feel it is so important to take time out this week and listen to God, to seek his guidance and his direction. You know, Samuel's life was marked by the fact that he had a close relationship with God and he learned to listen to God's voice. Now, when James was sharing the story with us earlier, he shared that when Samuel first began to hear and recognize God's voice, when he was asleep, he first thought it was Eli the priest, didn't he? And he went to Eli and he said, what do you want? But Eli recognized that it was the Lord, and he went and he helped Samuel recognize that it was God and encouraged Samuel to ask God to speak and then to listen. Maybe you've never heard from God. Maybe you're unsure what hearing his voice sounds like. So can I encourage you this week to say to God, as Samuel did, speak, Lord, your servant is listening. Because God doesn't just want to speak to leaders and teachers and other people. Actually, he wants to speak to each and every one of us directly. And as you do that, perhaps share what you feel God's saying with a trusted Christian. Or if you're in a house group, take it back to your house group and share what you think God's saying to you there. And wouldn't it be amazing, as James said, to actually hear the audible voice of God like Samuel did? I can just picture it now. Claire, when you get up tomorrow, I want you to, maybe actually you're one of the lucky ones who've experienced the audible voice of God. But actually scripture shows us that God speaks to us in many different ways. You know, in one instance, he used a donkey to speak. In another instance, he put the writing on the wall for Nebuchadnezzar. And in others, he actually spoke through the quiet whisper. And he most certainly does speak to us through his word in the Bible. You know, in John 10, we read about how God's the good shepherd, how he knows each of his sheep, how we can know him and how we can know his voice. So God knows us individually and he speaks to us differently. What's important is that we, like Samuel, learn to know God's voice and then listen to what he says. And like Samuel, we obediently follow it. So maybe, though you do know God's voice and he's guided you many times. And another thing that really stands out to me about Samuel's life is that he sought to hear God throughout the whole of his life. He didn't just hear from God once and that set him up for the rest of his life. But once he knew God's voice, he set aside time to continually listen regularly throughout his life. And we want to do that together this week, to set aside time to say once again to God, speak, Lord, your servants are listening. We want to seek God for guidance in our personal walk with God, in our lives together as a church family, and as a community seeking to emerge from this pandemic in the best way possible. Our theme for this prayer week is stepping forwards, seeking God's guidance in this next season. And we chose this because whether we're on our way out of lockdown or whether there are a couple more twists, who knows, we want to walk and hear from the one who knows exactly what is going to happen in 2021 and beyond. There's so much more we could say, isn't there, about the lives of Hannah and Samuel, and we've only really just scratched the surface. And hopefully in our midweek groups, you'll have more time to unpack some more of this. But I'm going to stop there and leave you just with these thoughts this week. Let's, in our prayer week this week, cry out passionately to God for all that's on your heart, for the situations that are causing you pain, for the pain that you see around you that you long for God to intervene in. Let's cry out for those we long to know the love of God, for those we would love God's love to make a difference to. And then let's make time to listen, to say at the start of the week, speak, Lord, I'm listening. I long to receive your guidance and your direction in my life. And then to join together whenever you have the opportunity this week and seek God together for our future and our direction as a church family. So before I hand over to Georgie to explain one of this week's activities, I just want to say one last thing to anyone who may have just tuned into this message on Facebook or YouTube because you perhaps decided to Google or search about prayer. We all know that the searches have gone up through the pandemic. So if you're one of those people, I just want to assure you God does hear your prayer. And if you cry out to him today, he will respond. It may not be in the way that you want, and you may need to learn to listen, but he will hear you. And if you want to talk to any of us at Gateway, then just get our details offline and get in touch. We'd love to talk to you.